So today we're talking about microaggressions, and we want to hint at, address some of the tools to recognize and mitigate them. We'll go over a series of topics very quickly. It's important to note here that microaggressions, we can talk about them for 5 years. We're trying to quickly give a foundational understanding in 2 hours. So we'll do our best to cover as much as possible. My name is Chisom Udeze. I am an economist and founder of some companies, one of which is Diversify. Really happy to be here and be back. It feels like I've been gone for such a long time since we've not done this in a while, but really happy to be here with Nikki and Jasmine. So Nikki and Jasmine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, thanks Chisom. Hello everyone, my name is Nikki. I am originally Australian. I'm from Australia. I've been in Norway almost 3 years and with Diversify for a little over 2 now. I'm a project manager at Diversify, but my background is in history and international development. So it's a pleasure to share the room with you all.
And hi everybody, my name is Jasmine Assulin. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Day, which is a Helsinki-based diversity, equity, and inclusion company helping other organizations on their DEI and inclusive communications journeys. I have worked in the DEI field for the past 5 years, but now 2 years through my own company, Day, and happy to be collaborating with Diversify today.
Thank you, Nikki and Jasmine. Okay. So here's the topic. In case you forgot, we like to remind you of things 3 times. So just going through the agenda right quick. Today we're going to talk briefly about unconscious bias, because if we don't address unconscious bias, it's really difficult to address microaggressions. And we're going to talk about types of biases. We're going to then focus in on microaggressions. We're going to nuance the difference between intent and impact. We're going to talk about the correlation between intersectionality, bias, and microaggressions, and also learn about how to potentially identify microaggressions and deal with them. We will talk about micro-affirmations, which is our way of providing specific tools that you can use to counter microaggressions. And we will have a breakout room session and then a reflection. We really hope that this is a co-created process. So we invite you to please share your opinions, challenge us. We're here for all of it. All right, and Jasmine is going to start us off.
Yes, thank you, Chisom. So like Chisom said, in order to actually understand microaggressions, we need to understand unconscious biases. And to get started with that, I want to do this quick mind exercise with all of you. So I want you to just think. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to write anything down at this point. But I just want you to think that what comes to your mind when you think about these following words. So when you think about a banana, what comes to your mind first? Then what about when you think about a leader? What about when you think about a coder, basketball player, professional boxer? And I always say that I mean like whatever this is and not like boxers, because that's confused some people sometimes. And then lastly, what comes to mind first when you think about an immigrant? I want you to reflect on that a little bit. And the next thing I'm going to ask you, if Nikki or Chisom could change the slide, is that did any of them look like this? So did the professional boxer that you thought about, did it look like a professional hijab wearing Muslim woman? If it did, react with an emoticon, not necessary, but you can, for example, react with some sort of an emoji or comment on the chat. Then again, if you thought about a banana, was the initial quick thing that came to your mind, was it yellow perhaps? Was it green? This can also depend on whether you like more raw bananas over more mature bananas in a way. At least that happens to me because I really like raw bananas. I don't know, maybe I'm weird like that, but I really like raw bananas. When you thought about a basketball player, was it a professional player in a wheelchair? When you thought about a coder, was the first thing that came to your mind a non-binary person and a person of color? Again, you can react or comment. It's up to you, your choice. And then this is one interesting one. When you thought about an immigrant, did you automatically think about a white person? Or was it perhaps a brown or a black person or a non-white person? That's just some food for thought, because this builds a bridge for us as a mind exercise to actually talk about what unconscious biases are. So let's move forward. Chisholm, you're muted.
Yes, I'm trying to unmute myself. Okay, so just quickly to go over what biases are. We have two main types. We have conscious bias, which are also known as explicit biases, and unconscious biases that are known more as implicit biases. Unconscious biases are attitudes that are held subconsciously. And it's important to note here that when we have subconscious biases or attitudes, they are not necessarily well-formed or coherent. Oftentimes, they might actually go against what we believe. Like we could, see, for example, say, on a religious basis, a Muslim presenting person, and have a thought about them that goes completely against what we actually believe, because we have people in our lives that are also Muslim and that we love fully and completely. So it's important to also note that when we have subconscious, biases, they're oftentimes quite ingrained into our psyche, and they've been informed by years of conditioning, by the media, what we've heard, in passing from friends, uncles at Thanksgiving, or it's formed oftentimes outside our conscious mind, and it's important to note the separation here. So in also going a little bit deeper into what is unconscious biases, as I said, often known as implicit biases, they are essentially stereotypes that are inherent or learned about people. So it's not also, I think it's important to note that it's also not always negative. We might hold unconscious biases about people that are positive in some sense, depending on which context or which perspective you hear of it. So I identify as, I am Nigerian, right? And oftentimes the experience of being Nigerian in the West, so let's say the UK or the US, can be quite different. On one hand, people might think, you're trying to scam them because you have an uncle or an auntie that has millions of dollars somewhere in a bank and they're looking to give it to you. Or the other hand, the general impression of Nigerians in, say, from an academic setting is that they are very, very, smart and studious, and they do exceptionally well, at least in the UK and the US. So in that situation, having this bias about me can be positive when you look at it from the perspective of Chisholm, you have to be smart. I mean, I'm smart, but still, not all Nigerians necessarily do well in school. So it's just important to say, unconscious biases are not always negative. They can also be positive.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that before we go to the different types of biases, these are unconscious biases happen in our brain. So it refers also to these mental shortcuts that our brains use to equip a lot of information that is thrown at us very quickly. And that results into, for example, subconsciously categorizing people, which can then lead, for example, into microaggressions that we are going to talk about a little bit soon. And I just wanted to quickly also comment about, someone said that actually, I thought about an immigrant when I thought about a white person, because I'm a white immigrant myself. So again, also having proximity to different kind of things. So the environment really formulates the biases that we have, like Chisholm said, and having different kind of proximity. If, for example, if I think about a female leader, and I think about Chisholm because she's a female leader that I admire and a woman of color that I admire. So the proximity actually guides my thinking. So just wanted to add something about that, but yeah.
Oh, thanks to know you admire me, yes.
I do.
Detail. Just wanted to also say quickly, because Jasmine, when you were talking, it jogged my memory. It is scientifically proven that we make, like, our brain makes conclusions about people within seconds, like mere seconds of meeting them. It's not 60 seconds, it's like less than 10, right? And it's trying to process millions of information at once. And this is also where unconscious bias builds from.
Yep.
And Nikki will talk us through some types of biases.
I will. Thank you so much. I think there was a comment in the chat there about the difference between subconscious and unconscious. And I think when we're going through these types of biases, that although there will be a lot over the next 2 slides, it's really helpful to be able to put a name to them as a process of becoming more aware of what you're observing or what you're kind of delivering yourself. So although there's a lot of information, we're not expected to remember it all. It's just helpful to be able to have a name to what you're experiencing. And although there are many, many, many types, the ones we've selected are perhaps more of the unknown ones, or the ones where it's not clear in the name what the bias is about, as opposed to, for example, height bias or ageism or gender bias. They're quite self-explanatory, but these ones are a little more unclear. So here we go. The first one is affinity bias, and this is a feeling of connection to those who are similar to us. Say, for example, you meet someone at a party, you discover they're a vegan and you're also a vegan. Then with this, similarity, you might find that you have a lot of, or feel that you have a lot of connections based on your dietary choice. Who knows? This could be also said for nationality. If you're, an immigrant in a country, if you find someone also from your country, it's like, oh, there's a lot of commonality there, or even political ideology as well. The next one being perception bias. This is the stereotypes and assumptions made about different groups. Let's take an example of a workplace situation where a younger team member doesn't invite the older team member to trial their video game in an after work gathering, based on the assumption that the older person might not be interested in video games. But perhaps the older person also has younger children and really enjoys playing video games with a younger child. But yeah, there wasn't to know. There was an assumption based on generation that the activity wouldn't be appropriate for the older person. With the halo effect, this is projecting positive qualities onto people without actually knowing them. And this is a positive impression that leads us to think favorably of this person. This is seen when we meet someone with a PhD, or they've come from a notable school or university, and we, straight away elevate them based on their experience or their education or their qualification. Confirmation bias is next. This is looking to confirm your own opinions and pre-existing ideas. And I don't know if anyone has seen the Social Dilemma documentary. Maybe you can give me a thumbs up with the emoticon if you have. This is a documentary about how social media works to create these echo chambers. And we observe the impact of confirmation bias here, where these predictive algorithms, feed us more content based on the content that we have watched previously. And perhaps you've watched a video about a cat doing strange things on TikTok, and then you get more and more cats in your feed. With cats, maybe that's really enjoyable and great, but it can lead to a lot of polarization if it's about political content or climate change, or perhaps during the COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of polarization with regards to the vaccines. And this is an example of how confirmation bias is, prevalent in our everyday lives and our interactions with social media. On to the next slide. We have attribution bias, drawing conclusions about others based on their behavior. Think, for example, if you're driving along, if you drive, or in the car, observing someone driving around you, cutting lanes quickly, going fast, based on what you've observed of their behavior, you might think they're, irrational, arrogant, maybe aggressive people. Or maybe in reality, they are, rushing to the hospital with a wife who's in labor, or, someone who needs quite urgent attention. Next, we have the Horns effect, assumptions based on a perceived negative traits. I think, unfortunately, a lot of overweight people can be stereotyped as being lazy or irresponsible. Or, you know, in the corporate setting, maybe less so now, but people with piercings or tattoos may be perceived to be unprofessional because of how they present themselves. Okay, the contrast effect is a distorted perception of something when drawing comparisons. And I think we see this a lot in recruitments, where it's, you know, sometimes when you have two candidates, it's, you know, go down to the very, very small details of as to why you make a decision about one of you over the other. It could be as small as one had their margins aligned when the formatting their CV, whereas the other one was a bit more messy in how it was presented. So this is an example of contrast effect. The anchor bias is a bias that causes us to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we are given about a topic. And so common in like any sales or marketing campaigns where you see a price tag of now $40 and like the original price kind of crossed out and to the side and in a smaller font. You see the $40 and like, oh wow, that's such a great value for this thing that was more valued at a higher price, for example. And I think this could also be a tactic in negotiating. I don't know if it's okay to say this, you know, when you price something at a higher level to begin with, in the knowledge that, you know, through negotiation, it will probably come back down to a price which is actually more, you know, reflective of the cost value. Okay, 2 more to go. The confirmation bias. This is a tendency to behave like others around you based on, you know, trusting your own judgment. I don't know if I know there are probably a lot of other internationals who have moved to the Nordic region in this Zoom call. I don't know if anyone has observed in themselves not taking the free seat on the bus in the knowledge that, you know, that's not what most people do in this place. People like their personal space. I've noticed that in myself, whereas if I was on a bus in Australia and there was a free seat, I would like run to get the free seat. And another example could be perhaps again in the recruitment setting, if a interview panel have, you know, a majority have decided to go with one of the candidates, and you actually believe the other one is better, but based on the majority opinion, you also, you know, side with the majority opinion. And our last one here is non-verbal bias. A positive or negative evaluation made on someone based on their body language, their personal appearance or style of dress. Is often related to cultural traits, such as someone wearing a hijab or a turban or a religious symbol. And, you know, there's a lot of overlap here. For example, the non-verbal bias can also be a positive assumption made by the halo effect or a negative assumption made by the horns effect. So there are, you know, a few different ways that these biases can fit into one another. So yeah, a few different types of bias, a lot of information. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful in you know, alerting you to some that maybe you're doing new and some that are perhaps new to you today.
I think I was just going to share, Nikki, like with conformity bias, one of the things I also find, I mean, it's not always, you know, negative, and I know you did not describe it as such. Like one that comes up for me is, you know, coming to Norway and then all of a sudden my wardrobe has more like black, gray and white things.
Absolutely.
You know, and I show up at meetings, you know, like I show up at meetings and, you know, I'm wearing like, you know, running shoes and, you know, just looking like, you know, super casual to like the most professional meetings, whereas I would not dare do the same, say in the US, in the UK, or even in Nigeria, you know, where, you know, high heels and all of this, which I love, but I have to say, I also really appreciate that I can just put on black pants and a black sweater and go to a meeting and still be taken absolutely seriously. So that's great. Jasmine, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to add to that. I once heard that the conformity bias is actually the mother of all biases from one person. And I think it was very, very descriptive, because I think it actually comes back to our very humane need of sense of belonging. So that's why I think like the conformity bias is actually very connected to our need to belong. And in Finland, by the way, in buses and in public transportation, people often even block this other seat because they want to be left alone. I just had to add that fact.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to do a poll. Nikki.
Yeah. So the first one is very simple, just to test your polling. I think the question is, were all of these biases known to you? So I'll bring it up now. This is a single yes or no answer, so just choose one or the other. You should see it pop up on your screen if you want to say yes or no. It's so fun from this side. I get to see all the numbers and the graph trickling in. Cool, we'll give it a minute or so. Great. All right, we have a few more people to answer, but perhaps not everyone is on the screen. So I will, a couple more. Last chance to answer now. I can end the poll and share the results. So we have 37% saying yes, and a bit more on 63 saying no. So cool to know that we've given you some new information today. Fantastic. All right, and then on the next slide is another question, and this one is multiple choice. So yeah, do you identify any of these biases in yourself? I'll launch the question here. A bit of a self-reflection. Don't be ashamed. We all have them. And I think, Chisholm, on the next slide, I've got an overview of all the biases I've talked about, just in case people need a something to trigger their memories. So it's okay to take a moment to think about it, of course. It's a bit of a reflective question.
And sometimes it's difficult to know, like, when you do not actually have a bias, because my first instinct is to say no to conformity bias, because I go, I'm just like, no, I'm going to do everything, separate from the norm. But then I'm wearing the clothes and I'm wearing the shoes and I'm going hiking and I'm skiing. So it's like, it depends on how you look at each bias as well, if it's like a positive or a negative thing. But I think we also, with the team, at least some of the team, we realized recently about the nonverbal bias when we were interviewing someone for a program we had. And, their body language was a bit all over the place. And that was the first thing we all said after the interview, like, oh, I don't know about this, their body language was all over the place. And then we had to catch ourselves mid-bias, like, no, we can't do this. We know better than this. So it happens.
And the question about, I think actually contribution bias is meant to be contrast effect. Is that also there? I think contrast effect is missing, so apologies, I set that up wrong. Contribution bias is meant to be contrast effect. Okay, so I'll close it off soon. Oh, there's a few more coming in. Okay, I'll ending the poll now and share the results with you. So we can see that all of the biases that we've talked about today are observable in ourselves, or one of them have come up at least every time. Very cool. I think affinity bias is up there at the top at 77%. And then halo effect, perception bias is also up there. Horns effect a little lower. I think it's, so interesting just to have a little reflective process about, what we observe in ourselves. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the next slide, if that's all right, Nikki.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I'll continue from here. Now that we've touched upon bias, we can continue to actually the cake of the day, so microaggressions. And like we said in the beginning, it's really important to understand unconscious biases on the background, because that is how microaggressions are kind of born. Because microaggressions refer to these everyday actions or behaviors that have harmful and exclusive outcomes despite our possible good intentions that we're also going to talk about very soon. It can be, for example, a comment or an action, a very subtle one. So also something that is not very evident, that often expresses some sort of unconscious prejudice. It might strengthen stereotypes. It might leave the person feeling excluded or make them question their sense of belonging in a way. So any kind of like comment or subtle act that can that a person can, for example, make towards another person. And this can also happen not only on an interpersonal level, but that's a deeper topic. And why I think that microaggressions are tricky is because of the whole intent versus impact thing that we're going to talk about, because it's really hard sometimes for us human beings to separate our intentions from the impact of our actions. But in addition to that, for the person who is experiencing microaggressions, why it is hard and difficult, it's because of their higher frequency. So imagine, we're going to have examples, like concrete examples about microaggressions soon, but the most discussed one probably ever is, where are you actually from? When you ask, for example, a person of color in a predominantly white society, that where they're actually from, when you hear that once, okay, you can think that maybe it's just curiosity, maybe they just really want to know where I'm from, maybe they are coming from a good place. But imagine hearing that, for example, on a weekly basis throughout your life, for example, as a person who was born, let's say like me, born in Finland, and you constantly get questioned about your origin. Even though the intention there wouldn't be bad, it results of lack of the ability of it results in not being able to feel like you belong, because you're constantly questioned about your ethnic background in a way. This was the beginning of our talk about microaggressions, and now we'll move on to more concrete examples, so you'll be able to identify them more in depth.
Thank you, Yasmin. So as Yasmin nuanced, I am also going to talk now about intent versus impact. Oftentimes, like she said, we have the best of intentions. So usually we just want to get to know you better, and I think I can even say for myself, as somebody who receives questions like this quite often, I've also been on the delivering end of questions like this. When you're just really trying to get to know somebody better, like, yeah, I know you say you're from this, but where are your parents from? Or where, you just want to get to know them better. But oftentimes it's received negatively, as Yasmin has nuanced, because it's the compounded effect, right, of that experience. So the intention is the aim or the plan, and the impact is the influence that it has on another person. So we have some illustration here for you. The intention is this person playing golf wants to hit that golf ball into the hole. And the impact, however, which is unintended, is that they hit that car that looks super expensive. Then it's going to cost them a whole lot of money to fix. So we tend to also, while we like to validate that our intentions are usually good, we say as well that it's important to consider that the impacts are oftentimes more harmful or catastrophic for the person who's on the receiving end. So I think that just to round up on, intention versus impact, one of the ways we think about it is to say that impact is greater than intent. And if you keep that in mind, if you find yourself in a situation where you have committed an unintentional slight, for example, you're able to go, yeah, Yasmin, I did not mean that. And I'm really sorry. This was not my intention, but I do understand and appreciate that this has caused you harm, and I will endeavor to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and I will learn from it, right? It doesn't make you a bad person by owning up to something that you have caused harm. It just makes you somebody who's willing to learn and grow. And that is an ongoing process for each and every one of us, right? And I think sometimes also reflecting that it might not always happen within the framework of, say, an interpersonal relationship. Sometimes you might use words that are microaggressive in a conversation, and somebody in the room might be negatively affected by it, right? And it's even like in using words that are ableist. Recently, I caught myself after I had said it, using the word spastic, right? Just to explain like, oh my gosh, I forgot something. And I use spastic to explain that. But you can also think about it when you say things like, oh, she turned a blind eye to something, or, oh, you're acting lame, don't act lame. If somebody is actually in the room who is lame, what they are is not a choice. It's who they are, it's their disability, and it's not something that we should use nonchalantly, but it is ingrained into our language. So when we find ourselves in those situations, it's okay to correct ourselves and move on. Okay, so now for questions for you all. What are some examples of microaggressions that you are aware of? Please share some in the chat. It could be, for example, like, where are you really from? Like Yasmin said. What other microaggressions have you drive well for a woman? Ain't that, yeah.
You speak very well for a woman of color.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, your English is so good. Yeah.
Oh, you are married. What does your husband do to a woman?
Yeah.
You are one of the good ones for immigrants. Yeah.
You're different. You're so different.
You don't look gay. Yeah.
Yeah.
You look good in white jeans. A lot of hair touching is also brought up.
Oh, yes.
In the comments.
Oh, God, yes. I recently had a situation, very recently, at an event where some woman comes up to me. Hadn't seen her for many years, and she said, oh my gosh, I've always loved your hair, because I had my hair in the natural Afro curls. And I said, thank you. And she's like, can I touch it? And I said, no. And she tried to touch it anyway. And I said, no, don't touch my hair. And for a slight second, I felt bad for saying no. And then I went, no, I said no, and you should respect that boundary.
I bet you wear the trousers in your relationship.
Oh, have I heard that one? Somebody has actually said to my partner, it's so impressive to see how you take the back seats in the relationship. And I'm just like, what?
And maybe one thing that is coming up from the comments is the fact that oftentimes microaggressions can be hidden under, for example, just trying to say a nice thing or a compliment to a person. One thing that I, for example, hear from time to time is that, oh, but you don't look Arab. I thought you were Spanish or Italian or something. Like, do you realize what you're saying? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think as well, are you the only Black woman in Norway? Well, there are a lot of us, but no, not often seen. Yeah.
Hey, I need to talk to a software developer. Where are the ones who work in this project? Client to a woman developer. Yeah, this happens a lot in tech.
Yeah.
In tech.
I think as well, the thing about Russia and Ukraine, and how a lot of Russians have faced negative repercussions, even if they technically did not start the war. But yes, your Swedish is good. Are you adopted? Fair enough. Yeah, that happens a lot. Yeah, and I've also been asked an old one, when I lived in the Netherlands, where somebody said to me they found me good looking, and they were very annoyed because they don't think Black people look good. And I was like, is that a compliment, or should I be punching you in the face? Yeah. So, all right. So we're going to share some more. Thank you all for sharing. associates joining and introducing himself to everyone in the room, male, and not myself, female, even though I was actually the client and the person heading up the meeting. Yeah, that happens a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, some of the examples here you all have already shared. So please keep sharing in the chats. I couldn't tell you we're gay. Is, you know, a lot of people who are gay face this. I mean, what does it actually mean to be gay? You know, should you kind of like stamp it in your forehead like I'm gay? When did you learn to speak English? When I look at you, I don't see color. Consistently asking women to take notes in the meeting. You know, like thinking disability is something negative that needs to be overcome. So saying to people with disabilities, like, oh my gosh, you overcame that. Amazing. Where are you really from? The most common one. So when are you going to have a baby? Assuming that every person who has an uterus is interested in having a baby or is even able to have a baby. Can I touch your hair? We talked about. Maybe you should pursue a less challenging career. I had a situation where I went back home some years ago to Nigeria, and somebody had, you know, having conversation the way you introduce yourself to people. And I had said, you know, like I studied a little bit too long, you know, in my life, but, you know, I said like I had 2 bachelor's, 2 master's, and at the time was pursuing a PhD. And some guy said to me, oh, you must not want to get married. And I thought, the man who is worried about marrying me because I'm too educated is the man I don't want to marry. So I think we're good, you know, but still, it's just this, women are supposed to, at least in this situation, women are less than or seen as less attractive if they're too educated.
Yeah,
well,
can I just add to that? Like, I mean, in the Nordics also, for example, as a result of structural racism, what happens is that there's actually research about how in high schools, the student counselors actually like guide people of color into different kind of professions, even though they would say that I want to become a doctor, or like not to say that, not to like give value to different kind of professions. But when a person of color is saying that they want to do something, they're kind of like guided to another direction because the student counselor might have biases and they might not believe in their abilities. That happened to myself as well when I was in high school. I told that I want to study global politics or international relations, and my student counselor told me that you would be better suited for customer service. And I got into study global politics, so I showed that student counselor. But yeah.
I hear stories like that quite often, Yasmin, just from younger people who say they want to be a pilot or a doctor, and they're told, oh, maybe you should be a nurse, maybe you should do this instead. So it happens. I see some questions here about we're all one race, the human race, as why is it a microaggression? So this is also something that we nuance because microaggressions are very much contextual. What somebody might consider offensive. Say, for example, my sister and myself who come from the same parents and grown up relatively the same way, studied in the same countries, traveled to relatively similar places. We have different experiences of the world nonetheless, and we might receive things differently, but we nuance that later. In terms of we're all one race, the human race, the context matters. Oftentimes, this phrase in itself, it's said when people are talking about systemic and structural discrimination that happens on the basis of racism. And then when somebody is saying that, oh, because I am of this race or this ethnicity, you know, I struggle, or when people talk about, for example, say white fragility or white privilege or, you know, socioeconomic privilege or something, oftentimes they get gaslighted and silenced with that whole all-encompassing phrase, we're all one race, the human race. Of course, we're all the human race. No one is saying that we're a different race, but within that context, you're silencing or tone policing somebody else from acknowledging that there is a systemic and structural barrier that occurs on a basis of race. So this is why in this case, it could be considered, depending on the context, as a microaggression. So another I hope that clarifies it as well. Yes.
Is it also similar when the comment is said, I don't see color, which is, you know, an intent to be, perhaps a good intent, but the impact is you know, denying people their experience and their upbringing and the situation that
absolutely. Absolutely. So it could also, yeah, like it's quite similar, and it depends on the context. Where I know, like in situations where some of my friends have said to me, I don't see color, I know what they intended and I know it means well, but it's also denying within the context of that conversation what is being said, right? And it's denying that something in some sense exists. But if somebody just like says on the streets we're all one race, the human race, perfectly fine, not a microaggressions. It just depends on the context. So another one, yes, and I think somebody else just said it's kind of like saying all life matters when somebody says Black life matters, for example. So that's also another one. I think another microaggression here is following people of color around in the store, or assuming they can afford something. I cannot tell you how many times this happens to me, most recently in Italy. And it doesn't matter what I'm wearing. If I'm donning all my designer outfits, it doesn't matter, you know, whereas my partner who is white can just walk into anywhere looking like a bum and not followed around the store. So it's quite interesting, at least for me, from that perception of an experience. All right. So when we also talk about microaggressions, it's also important that oftentimes well, I guess what I'm trying to say here is oftentimes microaggressions, they spring from single stories. And these are not always negative single stories, but depending on how many times you've heard it and who you are and the context through which you've received it, it can over time become a lot. So for example, a single story is assuming that somebody from Japan must love anime. So when you say, oh, you're from Japan, great. What is your favorite anime? It's just like, do you just assume that everyone in Japan likes anime? Also say for people who are Indian, you know, saying, are your Indian parents disappointed that you aren't a doctor? And I think that it's also important to nuance here that sometimes these single stories are funny and can be treated as such, but we need to be mindful to how, like in the context and the spaces in which we deliver them. So the thing with the Indian doctor, I just want to nuance quickly. I watch Trevor Noah, at least I follow him, and sometimes I find his stuff super funny. And he was talking recently, maybe some weeks ago, about currently in the world, an Indian man is the richest person in the world. So he's richer now than Jeff Bezos, who's now maybe the second richest person in the world or something like this. And he kind of made a joke and said, you know, but regardless of that person being the richest person in the world, he still goes home and his parents likely said, yeah, it's great you're the richest person, but you know, you're not a doctor, right? And in situations like that, you can laugh, right? Because it's meant to be a joke, but you also have to be tactful in how you deliver single stories and who's receiving it. So another one is, for example, assuming that Australians are good surfers. Nikki is living proof that they're not all good surfers.
Do not surf. I do not surf. I think the percentage of Australians that do surf is quite small, even though we're known for surfing. Yeah.
So things as well, like assuming people are exotic, right? Because they look different. And maybe that is a compliment to some people, but depending on the context you receive it. I've been to an interview when somebody said to me, oh, but you're so exotic. And I'm like, what does that mean? And is this the appropriate line of interviewing questions, you know? Or when you hear you're so different, those are often single stories because maybe you see I've also had a situation where someone said to me, you know, I'm so impressed by you because all the other Africans I know are like drug dealers or like they're trying to scam you. And I'm just like, what am I supposed to do with this information in single story, right? Another single story is assuming that somebody is not bisexual because they've only dated men. I think there's an importance of agency. People have the right to self-identify, and it is our job to accept people as they are and validate people and affirm people as they are. And also, just here for nuance, single stories would be only women give birth. And we know now that if we're moving beyond the binary, who's a man, who's a woman, that somebody who identifies as not a, man or a woman can also give birth if they have an uterus. So just something to be mindful of in general when we speak. And this is not like, there's no one book that you read to learn everything you must to ensure that you don't deliver a microaggression or like a single story that might be harmful to somebody, but it's really just about, learning over time and learning to catch yourself and like take a step back and correct yourself.
Yeah, learning and unlearning. That's something that I usually like to say, because a lot of the things that we have to unpack in ourselves regarding our biases and microaggressions, for example, also like require active unlearning of things, which is sometimes even more challenging than learning new, if it makes sense.
Absolutely. Like, well, I think another thing that I add to that is relearning. So you learn, you unlearn, and you also relearn. And one of the things I recently had to relearn was master bedroom. Like we say that all the time, like when you're going to view an apartment or a house, the master bedroom is usually the ensuite, the biggest room, maybe with a balcony. And I've been saying that my entire life, And a couple of years ago, I recently learned the history of that word, which was around the time of slavery, where the slaves would say, I'm going to the master's bedroom. And I had to relearn what that word meant and then unlearn it in a way and then stop using it. So yeah. Okay, so quick nuance here, and then I think somebody else is going to talk. So just on intersectionality, bias, and microaggression, what is important just to nuance here is, I just will quickly define intersectionality. Intersectionality is an analytical framework for understanding how a person's social or political identity combines to shape the way they see the world through layers of privilege or discrimination. It's very important to nuance here that privilege is fluid. It's constantly changing. You can literally walk into one room and have a whole lot of privilege and step out of that room, and 5 minutes later, you don't have any type of privilege. So context and situation exceedingly matters within how we view privilege within intersectionality. How it relates, just quickly, I'm going to move because I think we have a beautiful illustration here just to show that intersectionality, and how we experience the world happens along some of these frames. So they happen along diversity parameters. So you could have privilege on the basis of your religion, for example, if you are from if you're from a country that is predominantly Muslim or Christian. And if you're from another religion, you might not have privilege, but you might have privilege on the basis of your gender, your sexuality. So it's always nice to look at, in which spaces do I have privilege. So what I wanted to nuance here, if I could go back, but I'm not sure. What I wanted to nuance here is that with intersectionality and bias and the experience of microaggressions, it's important to note that what I consider a microaggression, another Black person from Nigeria named Chisom might not consider it a microaggression. So personal experience, lived experience most absolutely matters in how this unfolds. All right.
Great. Okay, we have now talked about what unconscious biases are. We have talked about what microaggressions are. Now we're going to move on to talking about identifying bias and how to react to microaggressions. And then Chisholm is going to talk about micro-affirmations as one practical tool that I really, really love. So we'll move on to that. But when we talk about identifying biases, before we again continue with microaggressions, here are a few things that I would like for you to remember. When we talk about biases, we often say that it starts with awareness, but that has to be transformed into action. So first of all, it's a continuous journey. And it requires an active or a conscious effort to mitigate bias. And this needs to happen also on an individual level. So we all need to do our own work. But then going to my point 3, in organizations, for example, they need to be identified, evaluated, and mitigated in processes as well, not just people. So this happens or should happen on an individual and organizational level. What this can mean in an organization, for example, is assessing, for example, your recruitment process. That's just one example. There are a lot of other aspects we could talk about, but identifying what it means, how it might reoccur in your recruitment processes, and then actually finding practical ways like structured interviews or whatever it is to actually find tools to alter the environment so that it reduces bias. Because it's also important to think about that in companies overall, when there's lack of bias, when there's diversity debt, when there's a lot of like homogeneity, that itself increases the risk of having more biases. And then having diversity itself organically helps us recognize more biases. It's not that simple, but it's something to remember, something that I hope you keep in mind. And for practical tools, I really recommend on an individual level that everybody goes into Harvard's web pages and you do the implicit association tests. So you can just Google Harvard implicit association tests. There are different kind of tests for gender, race, disabilities, etc., where you can actually learn to identify your biases. And for organizations, I oftentimes recommend using, for example, Slack's bias correct plugin. But yeah, and if we move on to microaggressions, so going back to what I just said, identifying biases is also a crucial part of being able to identify microaggressions. But when we talk about addressing microaggressions, I would actually like to start with accepting that they exist and why we actually came up with this step 0 or step 1 with Chisholm and Nikki when we're planning this, because even though it might seem evident for some people and for many people that we work with, for example, it's still even the addressing that they exist and accepting that is often challenging. And in addition, because you have to start with accepting that they exist in order to make it to step 2, which is knowing what to look for. So identifying them, because we can't start addressing them before we accept them and identify them. And when we get to the stage where we accept that they exist, we're able to better identify them, then we get to a point where we can speak up. So of course, this depends on the context. There are different ways to speak up. It's highly nuanced and it depends on the context a lot, but intervening behaviors can, for example, be simple micro-affirmations that Chisholm is going to talk about. So it all, speaking up and intervening doesn't always mean that it has to be addressing injustice in a way that that we kind of tend to think that what speaking up is. It can also be in other ways or with other kind of tools like micro-affirmations. But then the last thing that I would recommend is reaching out. So if you notice that someone experiences a microaggressions, and even if you wouldn't be in the right situation for some reason to speak up, at least reach out. So make sure that that person is not left alone. Make sure to reach out, for example, one-on-one if that suits you better, and don't leave them questioning their reality, because what also happens a lot is that when a person who experiences a microaggression brings it up, the person might get gaslit. So gaslighting means these subtle manipulative ways of making people question their own realities. So it's hard enough to deal with all of that, but then just having someone acknowledging your reality and that it's real for you can make a huge difference. And I wanted to also add something to this, because I just actually learned, I don't know if Heidi from Futurize from Finland is still here, but I just read her amazing LinkedIn post about how they at Futurize have this framework of AARM, where they acknowledge, apologize, reformulate, and move on. So I think that was just a really nice framework, or nicely put also a very practical 4-step framework of how we can address these kind of situations or situations of mistakes in a broader context. Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin and Haiti. I saw that post as well, really good. It's really nice to see like when organizations are actually putting things into practice and creating like, policies and frameworks that their employees, can work from, because sometimes people don't know how they're supposed to behave or react when something happens. But then when you've created like, here's a frame, let's start here. Like it makes life so much easier, and it's, like uplifts the culture of the place. And if it's a culture where we'll acknowledge things and we'll apologize, like it's quite nice where people are just like not afraid to say sorry, because oftentimes, the biggest thing for people is like, oh my gosh, when I say sorry, does that mean that I'm a bad person or I did this intentionally? Because that's like the conversation now I'm having with my 3-year-old daughter who hates the word sorry. She will say thank you and anything else you want in the world, but sorry, not happening. So I think like it's just that human, belief in some sense that the word sorry is like acknowledging that, we're a bad person, but it's just sometimes acknowledging that we did something wrong doesn't make us a bad person, and it's just a behavior. It's not about us, right? Okay, on micro-affirmations, I think Nikki is also going to help me here, just talk this through. Micro-affirmations, we practice this a lot at Diversify at our workplace, and we also talk to our clients a lot about micro-affirmations in terms of like, how do you start building a culture that affirms people rather than makes like jokes that or comments that might inherently be perceived negatively. So microaffirmations are small acknowledgements of another person's value. It's really subtle. It doesn't need to be like, oh my gosh, let's throw a huge party for Nikki, right? It could be something as simple as, Nikki, I really like that top, or really great job on that presentation. What comes to mind, Nikki?
As in like a micro affirmation that I like to receive.
Mm-hmm.
I thought of one the other day, and in front of my team, I haven't brought this up yet, but I think, when we're working on Google documents, if there's a comment with a suggestion or something, it's really great to like say yes or acknowledge the comment before it's implemented into the work, just to say, okay, yes, I agree, or one way or the other. That was just one that came up the other day, actually. But I think it needs to be a conscious process, and it's something that's comes about through dialogue and talking about what we need to be, acknowledged in our work, or even just, as we are. So yeah, that's what comes to mind for me.
I think like when we're talking with when we're planning this with Jasmine, one of the things she also mentioned, for example, would be if somebody gets interrupted in a meeting, that you can let the interrupter finish, but then you can also say, all right, Chisoma, I noticed that you interrupted Nikki when she was speaking. Nikki, what do you have to say? Like little things like that are affirming, so Nikki doesn't have to leave that meeting going like, oh my gosh, that like no one saw that and no one spoke up. And I feel like there's a microaggression, right? Because sometimes we do this unintentionally. And for those of us who talk a lot, like myself, like you might not catch yourself doing things. So just having someone affirm you and also just say like, and it's not, in this case, it would not be Jasmine saying, Chisom, shut up, you talk too much. It would be her just like acknowledging that, hey, Chisom, I noticed that somebody was trying to say something and you didn't, maybe you might not have noticed. So I'm just going to pull them in to say something.
Yeah, and one other concrete example is what happened to a colleague of mine. She was the only woman and the only woman of color in a meeting with white cis hetero males, and she was the only one bringing up that the importance of doing something about DEI. This happened like years ago, and she was completely shut down by one person in that meeting. And then like 5 minutes later, another man in that meeting said, but hey, let's go back to what she said. I actually think that this is something that we should talk about and take to our table. And so basically a small act of allyship, a small act of microaffirmation, kind of like giving back that person's voice and showing the value of what she was bringing to the table made a whole difference in her world from what she told me. So
It goes a long way. Like, I think like sometimes when, and I think every time this happens to me, I come to the office and I say something about it, either in person or in the meetings. Like when I'm walking from my home to the office and somebody smiles at me, because, you know, like we're so used to like people just like going, just someone is smiling at me. I'm just like, oh my gosh, they smiled at me. Or even like I've had a situation where somebody literally, a Norwegian person as well. And this is also where we challenge our perceptions because, you know, like for a while they had this idea that, you know, Norwegians, they don't talk to you. They just like stay away. I need my space. And a Norwegian person literally like ran after me to tell me that she liked my outfit. And I was just like, are you talking to me or are you talking to somebody else? I don't believe that this is happening, you know, like, but that was also affirming, you know, and it's so nice to have that.
I had an example last night in my yoga course class. The lady who I was practicing next to after we finished, she just said, it was really nice to practice next to you today. I loved your energy. And I was just kind of shocked, like, oh, thank you, you too. And I literally skipped home. It was just such a nice comment.
Absolutely. So some examples or more examples, asking people for your opinion. So for example, Nikki, what do you think? And Yasmin, what do you think? If you see that someone has been quiet or somebody is often quiet in a meeting, but they have a lot to say, maybe calling them in could be a good way. But of course, not putting pressure on them to actually say something, recognizing the achievements of others, recognizing the contributions of others. It's something that I intentionally try to do. I'm not always getting this perfectly, but I'm actively trying. So for example, I think that as a founder of a company, oftentimes it's so easy that all the credit comes to me, like, oh my gosh, Chisom, you're so great, you're so amazing. And I make a point to say we, my team and I, you know, because I know that I did not do it alone, even though I'm the face of it. So for me, that's an important way that I micro-affirm, you know, my team and colleagues who work with me. Using friendly facial expression and gestures. If you're like me, your face tends to betray you quite often when you have emotions. So I think just being aware of, and sometimes you could be thinking about something else and then your face is, you know, like doing something else. And I think just being present and listening to somebody and affirming them, you know, if they're saying something you agree with, even something as simple as a nod goes a long way. Taking a genuine interest in somebody's life, be it professional or personal, depending on the nature of the relationship. So essentially, you can think of micro-affirmations as a series of small acts of inclusion that add up to an overall feeling of inclusion and well-being for everyone. So if you know that your closest colleague is their birthday, just saying happy birthday, Nikki, makes a huge difference. You know, it's like, oh, you see me.
And like, I really loved how you said that it's kind of like a series of small acts of inclusion to add up to the overall feeling of inclusion and well-being. They can also have a very healing effect, like the few like real life examples that we were talking about where actually like a microaggression or a bias occurs, and then the microaffirmation can totally shift how you feel in those situations as a person who is experiencing them. So there, I think like, even though this might sound small, but I think the impact is actually pretty huge.
It goes a long way, you know. I think like as human beings, we really just want to be seen and heard and just to feel seen, like, oh, you noticed I had a new haircut, thank you, you know, like it makes a huge difference. Yeah.
And when we talk about, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, you know, it's a spectrum and it's a, you know, a continuum, and one feeds into the other. And I think these small acts of inclusion really feed into the sense of belonging that you know, that's the sense of belonging that is achieved when we, you know, have a micro-affirming culture.
Absolutely. Okay, so now it is time for the group discussion and breakout session, which will last about 15 minutes in the group. So we created a scenario for you. It is actually a real life scenario. We've made a few changes, but it's something that actually happened in real life. All right, now I'm going to read it, but please also read. So some days I read well, other days not so well. So let's see how well I do today. Heidi, thank you for joining.
Thank
All
you.
right. Scenario. My first job opportunity. No, you see, I'm creating new words. My first job out of university was at a world-renowned company. The company at the time was innovative, outwardly inclusive, and supportive of the LGBTQIA+ community. Through the years, I built close friendship with some of my colleagues. I came out to some of them after establishing that they were not averse towards LGBTQIA+ individuals. When I came out to them, there were no negative remarks, and our friendship was not affected. In fact, my colleagues and I felt even more comfortable discussing both our personal lives and work matters, and there was nothing else to hide. However, during a senior level meeting, while we were waiting for some attendees to arrive, a few of the senior managers openly voiced their disapproval of the LGBTQ community in regard to a recent debate that had emerged in the lead up to Pride Month. These senior managers assumed that everyone in the room would be supportive of their personal opinions, and they were very direct, impolite, and hurtful in their comments. Some of the comments made a mockery of people in the LGBTQ community. I was quite stunned when I heard these remarks. Some of my colleagues who knew of my sexuality were present in the room. Some of us sat in uncomfortable silence, while others laughed along. No one said anything to stand against their views, and neither did I. All right. So here goes the scenario, and then Nikki will work us through a breakout room.
Yes, so I'll create the rooms. You just have to accept it. It'll pop up on Zoom, and there should be, hopefully, one of the diversified team in the room. If you have any questions, you can ask them, and I'll also repost these questions into the room. So 3 things: what would you have done in the situation if you were a person of the LGBTQ community, or as an ally or bystander? What do you think should have been done in this situation, and what is the follow-up that you would expect given this scenario? So I will open the rooms now, and we'll have 15 minutes to discuss. Is it 15 or 10?
Here we just wanted to also kind of co-create practical tools and tips with the audience. So if anything comes to mind beyond what has been discussed already from the groups and also in the conversation so far, please feel free to pop them into the chat. I'm taking notes, and we're learning from each other all the time. So some of the things that came up for us was developing a micro-affirmation practice, like we discussed. Be curious and avoid single stories, knowing that impact is greater than intent. So always being intentional about not having a negative impact on somebody. It's important to listen, to understand, not to respond. Oftentimes we listen to get the next word in, but it's really sometimes important to just listen, shut up, don't say anything, reflect, and then come back. That's always a good place to start. Unlearn, relearn, and learn, as Yasmin nuanced earlier as well. Does anything else come up for anyone in terms of, how tips for ensuring we don't deliver microaggressions? Yasmin, Nikki, anyone in the chat?
I think what was said a lot is in the previous sharing is to ask the clarifying questions, and it's really difficult because sometimes we have these really strong reactions and to whatever has been said. But I think if we're in a place of listening to understand and not respond, it gives us a space to, process why and try and understand. And then from there, you can have that space to ask the clarifying question rather than just jumping into, a response straight away. So I love that so many people shared that one. Something that is, always, always can be worked on.
One of the things I also try to do is I ask myself, what is this here to teach me? because I like to assume, even correctly or incorrectly, that everything that happens in my life is meant to teach me something. So I just ask, like, what can I learn from this, you know? And sometimes it's I may not even be wrong, but somebody has a different perspective, you know, than me. And I'm just saying, what can I learn from their perspective? What can I learn from this? And how can I reflect on it, you know, removing myself from the situation and say, like, what can I learn from it? So that also helps me. Yeah, I think maybe one thing as well is be kind to ourselves, you know, because I think oftentimes we have this, I don't know about you all, but, you know, it's so easy for me to forgive everybody else. But when it comes to myself, oh, wow, like it's a process, you know, and just like kindness goes a long way for self, you know, knowing that we're not perfect and we're meant to make mistakes, you know, just like how do we address mistakes when we make them, but being kind, I think, has been good for my mental health, to myself, because to others, it's not that difficult. Okay, I guess we're going to move on. All right, so here we are coming to the end of this session. Does anyone have any questions, comments, feedback, inputs? A dance they want to teach us? So while we're waiting for potential questions or comments, and also just really, you know, give us input and feedback about what did you think about the workshop? Did you like it? What can be improved? You can also send us an email afterwards if you want, no problem. Next month's session, we are talking about race and masculinity. It's a huge topic. So please join us. I think somebody on the team, maybe Nikki, has posted the link. Sign up, it's free. We will have some really exciting speakers as well. Yeah, so join us on November 30. All right. And the last is contact information. In the email, I'm also going to share, we send a follow-up email to this to send you maybe a link of the video, I think, if you want to rewatch it. And we're also going to, I have her permission, so we're also going to share Yasmin's contact information. And if it's all right, Yasmin, that they also add you on LinkedIn to connect with you. Yeah.
Of course, always.
Can you share your link maybe in the chat?
I'll do so right away.
Awesome. But yeah, reach out to us for a chat, for a coffee, for a hangout. We like people. Come see us if you're in Oslo, and then come see us online as well. No problem.
If you're in Finland, Victor is at least, I see your face. Milla as well. Come say hi.
Awesome. Thanks for the great feedback. It looks like this practical session has been a hit. So maybe we'll have to do more. We'll see.
Yeah.
It's been really fun to join the session with you all.
It's nice to switch things up, I guess. Yeah. Thank you all for, you know, participating. You know, like it's a co-creation process, and it's nice to have your inputs, and yeah, really we appreciate your time. Like it's 2 hours and it's a long time. So for being with us, taking time out of your busy days, we really appreciate it and happy to have you here.
Thank you from mine and Day-Day's perspective as well. It was, and for Diversify as well. Thank you for having me as a co-guest host here today.
Thanks for being here. You know, we take every opportunity we have to like talk to you and have you in space. So. We'll be seeing you more. As long as you don't get tired of us, Yasmin.
Never.
And check out Day-Day as well. I can speak very strongly for the work that they do, and they work with clients not just in Finland but also across the world. I've met them both personally in their office and also seen a lot of their good work. So yeah, really proud to have you all as colleagues and co-collaborators.
Thank you so much, and likewise.
All right.
All right.